How does that look?
It looks great.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing over the last couple of years on non-local models for modeling multiphase fluids, and I'll explain what I mean by a non-local model and then what a multiphase fluid is. Please interrupt me and ask questions. I'm happy to take my time and answer questions as we go along or at the end. So Gabby covered this, but I wanted to talk some about how I got to what I'm researching. So I started doing research at Brown on suspension flows, which I'll talk about quite a bit, but suspension flows are fluid flows with solid particles embedded in them. So that was part of my PhD research. My focus in general is on computational fluid dynamics, which means how can we better model fluids using a computer? So I started working on codes for suspension flows, and then I started a postdoc at PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab. And there I started working on surface tension models. And then I converted to staff at PNNL, and I'm still working on the earlier topics, but then I started working also on machine learning for fluids. So how can we use machine learning to add to our understanding for computational fluid dynamics? So this is the applied math building at Brown, which is much prettier than PNNL's campus, much older. So PNNL is a DOE national laboratory, which is operated by Battelle. DOE is the Department of Energy. So PNNL's main campus is located in Richland, which is kind of in the eastern part of Washington state. I'm located in Seattle. So we have satellite offices in Seattle, Portland, and Sequim. Sequim is a marine sciences laboratory. Being in Seattle works really well for me, but it also means that I'm close to University of Washington, so I have the opportunities to interact there. So PNNL has several initiatives that they're working on right now. One that I'm involved in is the extreme scale data and computing. So we have a big focus in computing and efficient uses of machine learning for computing. I have a project that I'm not going to talk about today on working on a secure power grid and battery storage. And then we also have some national security focused projects like defending from cyber attacks and safe and efficient nuclear storage. So you might have seen these slides if you have other people presenting from the Sustainable Horizons Institute. But basically, the national laboratories are the largest scientific research system, and they were founded during World War II and then have grown since then. DOE funds the majority of our work, but we also have funding from the Department of Defense and NSF and various other federal agencies. And one of the reasons to come to the lab is we work on very big collaborations. So compared to academic institutions, we have projects with tens or hundreds of researchers all contributing and very large scale complex problems, which universities do as well, but I see them on a larger scale at the national labs. My work is more on the basic science side, more research focused instead of applying to problems. We're building the techniques, but we also have applied research programs and programs in national defense. So lots of very important discoveries have come from the national labs. One of my favorite to talk about is the Human Genome Project, where the national labs decoded DNA. There's also work across various fields. One that's relevant to my work is the supercomputing advances. So many of the DOE labs have supercomputers that users can access, and that is something that I do. We work with Argonne National Lab for supercomputer access and Oak Ridge to do large scale simulations. So the labs are located across the US. The multi-purpose labs tend to be the larger ones. And if you have questions about the labs, I have spent time at Sandia National Laboratory, so I can talk about that, and I can also talk about PNNL. Okay, so why did I choose PNNL? The big thing is especially as a postdoc, I could work on interesting research problems full time. So I don't have a teaching load. And I can focus all of my time on research projects, which is really great in establishing my career. But also I get to teach at University of Washington when I want to. So I can choose to teach a course one quarter, or I can choose to skip. And that's been really great for me. And I can choose what classes I teach as well. And that is one advantage for me of being in Seattle. I still get to work with students, and we get to work with interns. So I have interns over the summer, most summers. And then I also have some really, really nice collaborations across the DOE labs and universities. So I work closely with people at Sandia and then various universities. So work I'll show today is with someone at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I work with people at UC Santa Barbara and Stanford and MIT and Brown. And those collaborations are really supported at PNNL. They really encourage us to build up our collaborations. And then a really big thing for me was work-life balance and flexibility. So PNNL allowed me to be in Seattle while most of my team is in Richland, because being in Seattle does work better for my family. And we are now, I mean, everyone is virtual right now, but we are now allowing staff to be entirely virtual. So you could live anywhere in the US. International is harder, but you could live anywhere in the US. And that flexibility I really value. They also are really supportive of me and my family. So if you were here at the beginning, I have an 8-week-old daughter. And so I'm currently working half time so I can spend time with her. I have 20 weeks of maternity leave, which is amazing for academic research. And they've really encouraged me to do that. So that's something I really value. Okay, so if you are interested in internships, all of the national labs have internship programs. What I will say, so here are the websites. What I will say about PNNL is if you're interested in research, if you know someone who's doing something you're interested in, not all internships are posted, and we do have some flexibility. So if you don't see an internship that works for you, or looks like a good fit, it's worth it to reach out to the researchers and email us directly, because we can work with you. And we know the opportunities, and they may not all be online. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about multiphase fluids. And what I mean by that is a fluid flow with 2 or more components. So if you look at the Wikipedia page, it says almost all fluids are all important applications of fluids are multiphase. And I do agree with that. So examples of multiphase fluids are things like oil and water or blood flow. Sediment transport is an example on the right-hand side. This is Lake Geneva. And you can see the river here coming into the lake has particles embedded in it. That's why it is brown. And then those particles are mixing as it mixes with the lake. So a question we could ask is, where is that sediment coming from, and how is it, where is it going to end up? And you could imagine that having particles transported into like clear water would be a really big deal. And so you want to understand exactly where they're moving. Another example of a multiphase fluid is bubbles. So you can think of like a soda where you have bubbles in the soda. So today I'm going to consider first fluid-fluid flows, where we have surface tension is the dominant force. And then at the end, I'll talk about fluid-solid flows. So those are the suspension flows, like the sediment transport. So thinking about surface tension, I want to step down to the molecular theory of surface tension. So if we think about a fluid like water made up of individual water molecules, surface tension arises due to attractive intermolecular forces. So what that looks like is if we have a water molecule here, so it's suspended in the fluid, so it's surrounded by all other molecules. Each of those other molecules is exerting a force on this target molecule. And they're going to cancel each other out. So the net force on this molecule is 0. So there is no force on this molecule. But if you're on the surface, there are no water molecules up here to exert a force on this target water molecule. And that means the forces up here aren't going to cancel out with the forces down below the molecule. So there's going to be a net force on the molecule down. And that's what surface tension arises from. It's this imbalance of forces at the surface. So you can get phenomena like paperclip floating on water. So the surface tension is providing a counterbalance to the force of gravity on the paperclip. So the reason we're interested in a non-local model for surface tension is because we need multi-scale simulations for the applications we're interested in. So if you think about bubbles in a fluid, the bubbles you're familiar with are what we call macro bubbles. So those are bubbles that you can see. They're length scales of a radius of millimeters to meters, maybe in very extreme cases. And those bubbles behave like typical bubbles. So if you think about a soda, the bubbles are rising to the surface and popping, and that takes seconds for the bubbles to rise. So macro bubbles are described by the Young-Laplace law, which tells you about the pressure drop between the inside and outside of the bubble and the surface tension of that bubble. We're interested in the behavior over here where we have the nano bubbles. So can you see my mouse when I'm, okay, good. So we're interested in nano bubbles. So these are also called ultra fine bubbles. And these are bubbles with a length scale on the order less than 100 nanometers. So they're tiny. A comparable object is DNA, has a similar length scale to a nanobubble. So it's very, very small. And the interesting thing about nanobubbles is they don't rise to the surface. They're stable on the order of months. So if you have a bunch of nanobubbles in fluid and you go back and look months later, those bubbles will still be there. They don't pop and they don't rise to the surface. And the other interesting thing is they're really good at transferring mass. So if you have a nanobubble, it's going to attract any particles that are in your fluid, and then you can, if you remove the nanobubbles, you're removing those particles. So there's lots of applications in wastewater treatment or in drug delivery where you can use nanobubbles activated with particles to accomplish a goal. That doesn't work very well with macro bubbles because they don't transport mass well, and also they're going to burst. So you don't have a long time you can work with macro bubbles. The problem with modeling nanobubbles is the Young-Laplace law breaks down. So traditional surface tension models do not work for nanobubbles. Typically, if you want to model a nanobubble right now, you need to use molecular dynamics. And so that means you model every single molecule separately. That's very, very expensive because you need to model many, many, many molecules. So you're limited on the length scale. You can typically model a couple 100 nanometers. But we're interested in length scales that are on the order of centimeters or meters. So molecular dynamics will work there. I wanted to highlight one application of nanobubbles that I find really interesting. And so nanobubbles, we didn't actually know, scientists hypothesized they existed, but we didn't actually have evidence that they existed until about 20 years ago, when they could finally use a microscope and look at nanobubbles in very limited situations. And since then, there's been all sorts of really, really interesting applications. People have been putting nanobubbles in everything and seeing what happens. So if you use water activated with nanobubbles, it makes plants grow faster. One of my favorite applications is they put nanobubbles inside soft serve ice cream mix, and apparently it makes the ice cream taste better. I don't model ice cream, unfortunately. But this application is looking at ultrasounds. And so to get better contrast with ultrasounds, typically researchers will, medical staff will inject a contrast unit. So that increases the contrast on the ultrasound. So a typical one is called SonoView. So here, researchers, they put their finger in water, and the water either had nothing in it or nanobubbles or had SonoView, this traditional contrast unit, and you can see without anything, so we're looking at someone's fingertip here, the ultrasound is a little bit blurry and you get higher contrast with the nanobubbles, and it's actually the same as these commercial ultrasound contrast agents. But the ultrasound contrast agents that are typically used can have, you're introducing chemicals, so they can have complications, and in contrast, nanobubbles don't have those same complications, but they have the same results. Okay. So I said that the Young-Laplace law breaks down for nanobubbles. So I'm going to talk about our new surface tension model that we can use. So for fluids, we start with the continuity equation and the momentum conservation equation. So here we're looking at two fluid phases. So we can think about a bubble inside a fluid. So I'm going to call the phases alpha and beta. And then the vector in is normal to the bubble. And we have a macroscopic surface tension sigma naught. So we're going to consider the density and the velocity, and then the stresses and pressure of the fluids. And so we have the continuity equation and the momentum conservation equation in each phase. And typically you would use the Young-Laplace boundary conditions. So for a macroscopic bubble, these relate the pressure jump from inside and outside the bubble to the macroscopic surface tension sigma and the curvature of the bubble kappa. So this works for macroscopic bubbles, but it doesn't work for nanoscale bubbles. So we're going to replace the Young-Laplace boundary conditions with a surface tension force. So we add this as a forcing term to the momentum conservation equation. And I will show what this force looks like here. So this is our force. S is the force strength. So S depends on, so we're going to calculate the force at a position X by integrating over forces Y, over locations Y. And our force strength is going to depend on whether X and Y are in the same phase or X and Y are in different phases. And then we can solve for what the force strength is related to the macroscopic surface tension, and then we have the scaling term that depends on the force shape function. And the force shape function is a molecular-like force. So if you've done MD simulations, you would use a Leonard-Jones function to model the force between two particles, two molecules. So it is repulsive at short range and attractive at long range. Here we use the difference of two Gaussians instead of a Leonard-Jones force because mathematically it converges better for us. And the important thing about the force shape function, is we have this length scale epsilon. So this is new compared to using the Young-Laplace law in simulations. So that would be a local model. Here it's non-local because we are integrating over other forces instead of only using data at our position X. And then we have this length scale. And by changing the length scale, we can model either a macroscopic or a nanoscopic bubble. So if we want to model a macroscopic bubble, we choose epsilon to be small. So it's on the order of the grid spacing in our code. And if we want to model a nanoscale bubble, we choose epsilon to be large. So this works well in the nanoscale case. We can capture the pressure jump from inside to outside the bubble. So here we're looking at a bubble. So this is the pressure from the center of the bubble. This is the interface between the bubble and the fluid. And then we're looking outside in the fluid. Analytically, we know the pressure jump from inside to outside a macro bubble should be 1 times the bubble radius, or times the surface tension divided by the radius. So when we scale by the radius divided by the surface tension, we get the expected pressure jump. Something that's interesting is with our model, we get a negative pressure right at the interface. So that's not something you would see in a local surface tension model, but it is something that is seen in molecular dynamics simulation. So we do think it is physical, but we are still looking at why this occurs. So again, I said this, we're talking about non-local models. And so basically what that means is information about the force at a point F is going to depend on a neighborhood around the force. So we're integrating over this neighborhood to give us what the force at this point X should be. Okay, so I've implemented the surface tension force in a finite volume level set code. And we use a conservative level set method, which means that we have a level set. So this is, we call it the color function. So we have this function that's going to be 0 in one fluid and 1 in the other fluid inside our domain. And then at every time step, we're going to evolve the color function according to the velocity at that time step. And if we do this in a conservative way, we get conservation of mass. And we know we're not losing mass from our system. So conservation of mass is an important property we want. And then I will talk about this last bullet point more later. But the important thing here is the color function typically doesn't have a sharp transition between 0 and 1. It's not a step function. We're going to smooth it out over the grid. And we don't want it to get too smooth. So at each time step, we have an intermediate compression step that provides compression and means that we have a sharp fret. So we have a sharp transition in the color function. So we've tested a bunch of benchmark codes with our non-local surface tension. The first case I'm going to talk about is a drop in a shear flow. So here we start with a circular droplet, and then we put it in this linear flow. So the fluid is moving in one direction at one wall and in the other direction at the other wall. And what we know about a drop in a shear flow is the steady state shape of the drop becomes an ellipsoid. And we know that the length of this ellipsoid, it's called the deformation, has an analytical form that's been really well studied. So we can use this to test our code. So we've tested both the macroscopic case and the nanoscale case. So here on the right in the middle, we're looking at that deformation, so this value that we know. So the dotted line is the analytical value in steady state. So here my x-axis is the strain, which is a non-dimensional time. So we start with the circle and then it's evolving to this ellipsoid. The symbols are results from a previous work. And then the blue dashed line is the local model that we can compare to, and the black solid line is the local model. And so we can see that our results agree really well with all of the previous work for the black line. So the black line is a macroscopic bubble. The green dashed dotted line is a nanoscale bubble. So that's the one with the deformation that's larger. And that's what we expect for nano bubbles. They have a lower surface tension, so they should have a larger deformation. And so we're capturing the desired nanoscale effects, and we can also capture the macroscale effects with the same surface tension force just by changing the length scale. And we also, so at the bottom, I'm showing the final shape of our bubble. With the level set and non-local model, we agree really well. So both the local and macroscale shapes agree well. And then if we look at the nanoscale bubble, it is more elongated. It has a shape, we call it a sigmoid shape. And that's what you see when you have really low surface tension at these areas with high curvature. Okay, so after we did one drop in shear flow, it made sense to do 2 drops in shear flow. And this is actually a really hard problem. And the reason for that is these drops are going to collide. And as they collide, the fluid inside the drop, or between the 2 drops, or between the 2 bubbles, is going to have to drain out between the 2 bubbles. So no matter how much you refine your grid spacing in your code, at some point the distance between the 2 bubbles will be less than the smallest grid size. And at that point, you can have what's called artificial coalescence or numerical coalescence, where the bubbles collide in your code, not because they would collide in real life, but because you cannot resolve the distance separating the 2 bubbles. So I'll show what that looks like in our code with the local model. So for 2 bubbles in shear flow, there's 3 behaviors possible. So one is called merging. So the 2 bubbles slide past each other and they merge. And so we end up with one large bubble. The next is called bridging. So the bubbles slide past each other and they merge and then they separate again. So they form a bridge and then they separate. And then the last case is called sliding. So the bubbles are going to slide past each other, but they never merge at all. So we want to be able to see all 3 of these behaviors in our code, and we can. So if we use the level set method, this is the local method with the previous surface tension model. What we see is the behavior depends on the resolution of the code. And this is where we have numerical coalescence. So here I'm showing a close-up of the color function. So this function is 1 in one fluid and 0 in the other fluid. And then you can see the smooth interface between the 2 fluids. And what you can see is at this later time, the 2 bubbles have merged because this smooth interface between the 2 bubbles is overlapping. So we have this green area. So the bubbles have merged, but that's actually in this case not physical. They're just merging because the resolution is too low and we can't resolve this gap. But the important thing here is no matter how much I refine the gap, they're still at some point going to be so close together that we cannot refine more and have a reasonable computation time. So what that looks like in practice is here I have 2 different capillary numbers and we're looking at increasing the resolution. So I have 3 different resolutions, and then as going down, we're looking at increasing time. And what we can see here is as we increase the resolution with the local model, we have different behavior. So here, the highest resolution hasn't merged yet. The blue one, which is the lowest resolution, has already merged. In the end, they all have merged. So we're all getting the same behavior, but it's happening at different times. And in even worse cases, so this higher capillary number, we have some cases where they merge and some cases where they don't merge. And that's not the behavior we want. We want the behavior of the bubbles to be independent of the grid spacing. And so if we do the same thing with the non-local model, so here they're the same figures, what you can see is we have the same behavior. So in these two cases, they both merge, but they also merge at the same time. So that's a really big benefit for the non-local model, is we're not seeing artificial coalescence in the same way. Instead, we see that the behavior depends on our parameter epsilon. So again, that's the length of this force. Epsilon determines the support of the surface tension force. So larger epsilon means we have a longer range force. And another way to think about that is a larger epsilon corresponds to smaller bubbles. So at this extreme scale of really large epsilon, we're seeing nano bubbles, and small epsilon is macro bubbles. So if we decrease epsilon to the limit of epsilon goes to 0, the bubble behavior is going to become independent of epsilon. And then as we increase epsilon, we're looking at smaller bubbles, and that's where we do see the merging. So we can switch between this sliding and merging behavior by increasing epsilon. Okay, I'm going to switch now to talk about the rising bubble benchmark. So this is a benchmark that's been studied a lot because all of the data for it was released in this paper by Heising in 2009. So it's a really nice benchmark because we can compare directly with their results. And there's these standard parameters that you look at. So it's the velocity of the bubble and the time where the maximum velocity occurs, and then the circularity and the time that the minimum circularity agrees. And what we can see is our non-local model. These are two other codes with local models comparing with the benchmark. And the non-local model either has errors that are on the same order of magnitude or much smaller than the local models. We agree really well with the final location of the bubble and also the rise velocity. So the benchmark actually consists of 3 different codes where they did the same problem with really high accuracy. And we can see that our solution is actually bounded by their solutions at the maximum. So the non-local model is really accurate for the rising bubble case. But the reason I like the rising bubble case is it shows the importance of what I call the compression diffusion equation. So here we're looking at the color functions. So yellow is a value of 1 in one fluid and 0 in the other fluids. And we're looking at the bubble as it's rising. And so we have to advect the color function at each time step. And then we have the compression diffusion equation. So what happens if we don't use our compression diffusion equation is we're losing mass in the wake of the bubble. So the color function is smearing out, which means the bubble is losing mass behind it, and that's bad. We know that bubbles don't leave mass behind as they move. So the compression diffusion equation basically makes the front between the two fluids sharper. So it's going to compress this interface towards the center of the bubble. And this gives us this really sharp interface. But up until this point, the compression diffusion equation has only been applied to 2 fluids at a time. And applying it to more than 2 fluids has numerical difficulties. So it's really easy to extend our surface tension model to 3 fluids. The details are on arXiv. But adapting to more than 2 fluids is really hard for considering how to represent and advect the color function. So when we have 2 phases, we can have 1 color function. So it's going to be 0 in one phase and 1 in the other phase. Within phases, we're going to introduce in color functions. So each color function will be 1 in phase I and 0 in all of the other phases. But then we need to consider how to advect the color function, so how to move each of these in independent color functions so we don't get any voids. So the fluid area is defined as the area where the color function is greater than 1/2. And here in the center, we have no fluid indicator function or color function is bigger than 1/2. So there's just no fluid in this gap. And that's not physical. It's like we introduced a vacuum. And we also can't have overlaps. So that would be a case in which you had 2 phases in the same location, and that also isn't physical. So we need to come up with a numerical method that can limit these 2 cases. So one way people have done this in the past is said, instead of in color functions, we're going to have n-1 color functions. So this last fluid phase is going to be defined as wherever there is no other fluid. And the problem with that is it's not unique. So right here, fluid 1 is filling the void. But if I picked fluid 2 instead, I could have fluid 2 filling the void. And so you may get different behavior depending on which fluid is filling the gap. So we're going to stick with in color functions. And then what people tried was, okay, we're going to advect and solve the compression diffusion equation independently for each color function. And the problem with that is it doesn't limit overlaps or voids. So in the limit of the continuum model, so if we could solve this exactly, our velocity field is smooth everywhere in the domain and continuous. So that means that also this advection step should be continuous everywhere, and we shouldn't get overlaps and voids. But the problem is in any numerical code, we're introducing errors because we have discrete resolution. This method doesn't limit the overlaps and voids. It does well enough if you have high enough accuracy, but if you're interested in problems where you're considering triple junctions, which are areas of intersections between 3 fluids, you're going to introduce problems that you're going to start seeing voids. So we invented a new method. We call it the in-phase conservative level set method, or NCLS, where we've changed the compression diffusion equation to add a Lagrange multiplier. And what this Lagrange multiplier does is that it ensures the sum of the derivative of the color functions with respect to time is 0. And the reason this works is we start with the color functions well defined. So we know that the sum of the color functions everywhere in the domain is 1. And then since the sum of the color functions everywhere is 1, if the derivative with respect to time, so the change in the color functions, the sum of the change in the color functions is 0, the sum of the color functions everywhere in the domain will stay 1 throughout time. And so this will limit the overlaps and voids that can form. So if we look at how this works on a really simple case, we're going to consider my triple junction example, and we're going to initialize a simulation where the color function is defined as 1 if that grid cell is inside fluid 1 and 0 otherwise. And then the same thing for the other 2 fluids. And then we're going to repeatedly solve the compression diffusion equation and see what to steady state and see what happens. So if you solve independently, so this is the old method, you get a void here. So this area in the center has no fluid in it. And then we also have an overlap here. So there's 2 fluids in that regime. So that's not physical. But if we do the same thing, but with our method, we're minimizing the void. So the void is on the order of the grid spacing. It will get smaller if you increase the resolution, and we're not seeing those overlaps. We do have the diffuse interface between the phases, which is what we want, but it is really tight. So it transitions from one fluid to the other over a couple grid cells. So one really nice benchmark problem to consider for where triple junctions are really important is called the liquid lens. So in the liquid lens case, we start with a drop at the intersection between 2 fluids. So we have a drop of fluid 2 between fluid 1 and fluid 3. And then this drop is going to elongate. And the length that it elongates to will depend on the surface tension between fluid 1 and fluid 2 and fluid 2 and fluid 3, which we will set as equal right now. So depending on the surface tension, as we decrease the surface tension, the drop gets longer. And we can consider first what happens if we increase the resolution. So this is looking at 3 different resolutions with the same surface tension. And we can see that void that forms. There is a void, but it is really small, and it is getting smaller as we increase the resolution. So in the limit of infinite resolution, that void would go away. And then we can also look at the analytical deformation of the drop compared to our method in CLS at 2 different resolutions and the traditional method. And what we can see is our method is more accurate because we don't have overlaps and voids that form. What's more important, so if you look at the numbers here, our method is more accurate. It's not a huge difference. But if you look at the error that forms, so we know that the sum of the color functions should be 1 at everywhere in the domain. So here I'm looking at 1 minus the sum of the color functions. And so that gives us the error in the conservation. So how far off we are. So even though the deformation with CLS is approximately correct, there's about a 20% error in the sum of the color functions. So we have an overlap here, and we have a void that forms. NCLS is significantly more accurate. So it's like 4 orders of magnitude more accurate in maintaining that conservation and limiting overlaps and voids. And same thing if we increase the surface tension. And so what that means is the area of the fluid phases, which corresponds to the mass of the fluid phases with the traditional method, is decreasing. So this fluid phase 1, this fluid at the top in the simulation, is losing mass over time. With NCLS, the change in area is 2 orders of magnitude smaller, and it does converge. Whereas with CLS, the simulation isn't stable. It doesn't reach a steady state because it's not physical to have those overlaps and voids. So you continue losing mass over time, which is really not ideal. Okay, so the reason I introduced all of that is because it gives us a way to look at 3-phase flows. And the reason we're interested in fluid solid flows with nanobubbles is up until the 90s, there was no way to image nanobubbles. There was no way to look at them. With increases in microscope technology, we can now look at nanobubbles, but only on a surface. So we needed to be able to model the solid phase as well. So here's one of the first images of nanobubbles on a surface. And then we can also do molecular dynamic simulations of nanobubbles on the surface. And the interesting thing about nanobubbles on a surface is we know a lot about how bubbles behave when they're put on a surface. And in particular, they have this contact angle theta. And the contact angle theta depends directly on the surface tension. But nanobubbles are a lot flatter than we would expect. So this contact angle is much smaller than you would expect given the surface tension. So they do not behave like macroscopic bubbles at all. And this is an active area of research to try and understand why. So what that looks like is, depending on the surface tension, which here they denoted as alpha, we're going to see a difference between the macroscopic contact angle theta naught and the nanobubble contact angle theta. And that's going to, so the nanoscale contact angle is going to decrease as we decrease the size of the droplet. So the reason we needed this in-phase advection scheme is if we tried to do the nano droplet on a surface using the traditional model, what we get is on the right. And what we can see is we have a really big void that forms. We also have a void that forms in the center of the bubble, so there's a vacuum there. And we have overlap. And then if we measure the contact angle, so this example should have a contact angle of 60 degrees. The contact angle is completely incorrect. And that's because the surface tension force is not well defined if you have a void. If we use our method for the in-phase advection, we limit that void and we are able to capture this contact angle very precisely. So this is looking at a length scale epsilon of 0.02 in the surface tension force. So this is a macroscopic bubble. If we instead increase epsilon, so we switch to the nanoscale bubble, we get a flatter bubble. So we have a smaller contact angle here, which is exactly the behavior we expect for nanobubbles. Interestingly, we have this inflection point in the curvature of the bubble. And that is something that has been seen in MD simulations. It hasn't been seen in the microscope studies of nanobubbles, but the problem, the accuracy of the microscopes is so small that we wouldn't see changes like this with the microscopes. So this is something we are looking at, but it is something that is seen in MD. And so then we can look more at what happens when we change the length scale of our surface tension force. So we're going from these are all nanobubbles, but we're decreasing the size of the nanobubble, which is when we should see the contact angle decreasing as well. And that is the behavior we're seeing. So we go from taller bubbles to flatter bubbles as we increase that length scale. And we are getting an approximately linear relationship between the differences of the cosines of the contact angle and the macroscopic contact angle as we make the bubble smaller, which is again what we expect. So we're really excited about this work because it's the first grid-based method that can model nanoscale surface tension effects. It also is the first level set method that can accurately consider in phases in a conservative way. And we're really excited for the applications that we can now get to for nanoscale bubbles. But the only way we can do that is with this non-local surface tension force. Okay, I'm going to transition now to talk about more recent work I've been doing on suspension flows. this is work that came out of my PhD thesis where I was working on modeling suspension flows. And now I'm looking at how can we use more recent methods to get more information out of those simulations. So we're considering very densely packed suspensions. So here we have spherical particles that are embedded in a fluid, and 40% of the fluid is filled with particles. So I'm not showing the fluid here, just two different sizes of particles, and you can see how tightly packed they are. And because they're so tightly packed, that's going to change the dynamics of the fluid. And also we have really strong stresses that form between the particles. So if you look at, this blue particle here isn't free to move wherever it wants. It's going to be constrained by the particles around it, and we're interested in what effect that has. Okay. So suspension flows are fun to study because they're really, really common in nature and in industry. So a really typical example is blood flow, where you have red blood cells and white blood cells in serum that are all suspended. So that's an example with deformable particles. An example that's getting a lot of press right now is fracking or shale gas extraction. In fracking, the fractures are kept open by fluid that's injected that contains particles. So those particles form stress networks to create the fractures and keep them open and keep them from collapsing. An example of an industrial fluid that is a suspension is paint. A lot of beverages are suspensions like milk or beer. And then an example that is becoming, unfortunately, increasingly important for our lives is wildfire smoke is a suspension. So this bottom picture is Santa Barbara on a clear day, and then Santa Barbara during wildfires in 2018. And you can see the visibility is completely gone because the smoke particles are not modeled. In Washington, we get the smoke from the fires in California come up to Washington. And something I've learned is that weather models do not take into account these suspended particles in the atmosphere. And because the smoke is so dense, that's actually changing our weather. And so in Seattle, we can't predict the weather in wildfire season because we don't know where those particles are and how they're moving. They're not taken into account. Also volcanic ash. So the volcanic ash cloud that grounded flights over Europe due to the volcano in Iceland is a very similar example where we have smoke suspended and we need to know where those particles are moving so we know where it's safe for airplanes to fly. So I'm going to consider a simplified example. So we'll consider a Poisson flow or a parabolic flow in a planar channel. So this is a 3D channel, and we're going to fill the channel with 40% particles by volume fraction. So what happens with this case is we start with the particles equally suspended throughout the channel. So they're evenly distributed. And then over time, the particles are going to migrate to the center of the channel. So we're going to have an increased number of particles at the center line, and then we'll still have particles out on the edges. I simplified this a little bit, but we're going to have a lot fewer. So this case obeys the steady state momentum conservation equation. So that's this equation here. Mu is the shear rate dependent viscosity. So that means that mu depends on the derivative of the fluid velocity. The fluid velocity is denoted by U, and then we have a forcing term C here. So in my case, where we have a pressure-driven flow, the forcing term C will be the derivative of the pressure. So the pressure drop from one end of the channel to the other. Okay. So here I'm going to introduce a physics-informed neural network. And the reason we're doing this is when we get to the non-local model. So when I talked about the surface tension, we had that force scale epsilon that we don't necessarily know what it is in the beginning. Here we're going to introduce a non-local derivative as well. So we're going to change the steady state momentum conservation equation to a non-local form, and we're going to have values we don't understand, or we don't know how to derive before. So we're going to use a neural network to find those values. So first we're going to set up the neural network to solve the local equation, and then I'll talk about how we switch to non-local. But first I want to introduce what a physics-informed neural network is very quickly. So this is work that was started by George Karniadakis' group at Brown. Paris Perdikaris is now at University of Pennsylvania. And this is a figure from one of their papers. And the idea is we want to model the fluid velocity u, and we know that the system satisfies a differential equation. So we're going to call that operator F. So we have a nonlinear differential operator. So in our case, that's a momentum conservation equation, but it could be a different equation. So we have our input variables, which are the location and the time, so x and t. We're going to use a neural network to learn our velocity u. And then with neural networks, we can do what is called automatic differentiation, which means we can find the derivatives of u with respect to our input variables and use that to create our nonlinear differential operator f. And then we can also enforce initial and boundary conditions. So here we might know that u will match a velocity profile from our simulations, and we'll know some boundary conditions about it. So we can create a loss function, which basically means the error between this operator and the boundary conditions and our initial condition. So that gives us our loss, and then we're going to minimize our loss. And when we do that, we learn a velocity u that satisfies our differential operator. So I'll show what this looks like for our specific problem, but basically we have the loss functions that are looking at the difference between our input values, which is the velocity u at a position I, and then the error in satisfying this equation here. And we consider the error at the collocation point. So these are the points denoted by sub f. So for the suspensions, we want to satisfy the momentum conservation equation, which is given by this equation here. So we're going to introduce our neural network F that satisfies the differential equation. And then we also introduce neural networks for the velocity u and the viscosity mu. And that's all incorporated into our loss function. So what we want to do is minimize the loss function, where the loss function considers velocity measurements. So those are measurements we're going to get out from simulations. We also have Dirichlet boundary conditions. So we have the velocity at the two channel walls. We consider the error in the momentum conservation equation. And then optionally, we can consider viscosity measurements. We don't have to. So for the simulations, sometimes we know the viscosity and sometimes we don't. We can also use this as a model to learn the velocity. So here I'm going to talk about we take velocity measurements and we learn the viscosity. We can use the opposite as well. This paper is on arXiv in the local case. So still considering the local case, we've considered a whole bunch of different examples. One looks at DPD, a dissipative particle dynamic fluid with equal sized beads connected by springs. So here, the length of each chain of beads is of length 2. And we're learning the velocity profile, u, and then we learn the viscosity, and then we look at the error in the momentum conservation equation. So if we look at the velocity, our PIN results is our neural network results. We consider with and without viscosity measurements, and we're looking at the agreement to the red line, which is the data. The interesting thing here is that when we include the viscosity measurements, our accuracy actually decreases. And the reason for that is this simulation doesn't exactly satisfy the momentum conservation equation. So we're essentially introducing too many constraints on the problem. But we can accurately learn the velocity profile, and we can learn the viscosity, and then we can satisfy the momentum conservation equation really well, just using velocity measurements. And we can do the same thing with a chain of longer length. So here we are again learning the viscosity profile quite well. This gets harder with the suspensions, and the reason for that is I said that the particles migrate to the channel center line. So at the center line, the viscosity is going to increase significantly, and the particles are really, really tightly packed together. So if we look at a slice down the center of the channel, this is what the particles look like. So you can see if you have, consider this particle here. If one of the particles over here moves, it's going to impact this chain of particles, and it's going to move this chain. So if we consider a local model, we're losing this inherent length scale based on the particle size, and we're ignoring all non-local effects, all of the effects of these chains of particles. So this uses the non-local model, and what we can see is we can learn the velocity profile quite well. The viscosity profile at 0 shear rate is significantly lower than we would expect. And what that translates to is the suspensions are interesting because we have an analytical model for the viscosity. So here I'm showing the analytical model for the viscosity as the dashed dotted and dotted lines. And then the symbols are our learned viscosity for 3 different initial volume fractions, so 3 different percentages of the channel filled with particles. And the solid symbols are away from the center line, so where the particles aren't densely packed, and the empty symbols are at the center line. And what we can see is at the center line, the results that we're getting from our neural network and for the local neural network are diverging from the viscosity, the analytical viscosity profiles. And in some cases, they're actually decreasing, which is a little bit surprising. So this tells us that we're missing information here. We're missing information at the center of the channel due to those non-local effects. So this is work that I'm working on right now in collaboration with Sandia. And what we want to do is replace the local derivative in the momentum conservation equation with a non-local derivative. So this is our non-local derivative. So we have the viscosity mu and the fluid velocity u. This is a non-local diffusion equation. And then we have 2 parameters that are unknown. So one is this parameter s in the denominator here. And then one parameter is this delta. So delta is going to be the length scale of this non-local derivative. And I'll talk about delta here. For this work, we've fixed s. But we don't have any way of knowing what delta should be. And so that's why we need this neural network, so we can learn what delta should be. So we do the same training we did before, but we use the non-local derivative instead of the local derivative, and we're training for delta in addition to the viscosity. So we do learn the viscosity profiles again, and then we learn delta. And this is part of what makes me really excited, is the delta then has physical meaning that we can understand. So for lower volume fractions, so fewer particles packed together, we learn a smaller value of delta because the particles are less coupled. There's more space between the particles. And then these really tightly packed particles, we're learning a value of delta that's on the order of 3 particle radii. So what that looks like is if you look at a couple particles, and then I highlighted the ball of radius delta around those particles, and you can see we're accounting for all of the effects of all of the neighbors that are touching that particle. So we've now included the effects of the 3 body interactions between the particles, and so that is increasing the accuracy of our model. Okay, so I'm going to stop here so we have time for questions. I've talked today about 2 non-local models, and the idea is that these problems have physical relevant length scales that we need to incorporate into our forcing terms and into the model. It opens the ability to do no computational fluid simulations. So before we couldn't even model nanobubbles, and it opens opportunities for new multi-scale simulations. The problem with non-local models is you do introduce this length scale, where if you don't know what the length scale should be a priori, you don't have any way of getting out of your problem. I showed a way we can use machine learning to help determine those parameters, so you can then use them in future problems. And I put my email here. If you want to reach out, I'm happy to talk to anyone at any time. So please do feel free to email me. But also I will answer questions, and I can stay as long as you want to answer questions today. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. Let's virtually thank and applaud. Well, thank you so much. That was an awesome talk. Does anyone have any questions for Amanda? I can start because that's the way it is. Yeah, I have. So one of my questions is, what do you use for coding? What interface or language do you like?
So most of my work is done in C or C++. One of the things you learn is you inherit a lot of code. So the suspension code has been passed down through generations and generations of grad students now, and I just passed it down to a new PhD student. And that means I ended up using the languages that other people are using. So that code was in C++, so that's what I started using. I do a lot of high performance computing. So that code is parallelized. It couldn't run in serial, it's too expensive. So that C is nice because then I can use MPI to parallelize the code. We also use a lot of MATLAB. A lot of what we're doing is prototype code, so MATLAB. And then if you're doing machine learning, you kind of need to do Python. Most of the machine learning work right now is being done with TensorFlow in Python. So all of the machine learning work is in Python.
Right.
I will say, if you're interested in computations, Argonne National Lab has a summer school in high performance computing that is absolutely excellent. So people, you should consider applying to that. It's completely free and anyone can do it. So it is open to international students. It's a 2-week summer school. So if you're interested in high performance computing, that is the best place to learn, because all of the national labs send people to it's the Argonne Extreme Computing Program. All of the national labs send people to that, and so you're learning these packages from the people who wrote the packages, which is super cool and super worth doing.
That sounds awesome. Thank you. I didn't know that.
It's I think applications just closed for this year, but it's every year, so it is definitely worth applying to.
That's awesome. And I think, well, I don't know how many others, but I'm an international student, so I'm especially interested in summer schools that take internationals, because it's not that easy.
Yeah, so I think they have to, because they pay for travel, they do limit international students coming from international locations. But if you're within the US, that doesn't apply.
Okay.
Already. And you can still participate. Just travel's more expensive from international. Yeah.
That's awesome. And I guess on that same line, do you see, like, are there a lot of international students where you work? Like, do you interact with internationals in the national lab?
Yeah, so it's going to depend on the lab, who they can employ, depending on the programs of the lab. So at PNNL, we have a completely open campus, which means we have, I am a US citizen, and I think I am the only US citizen on most of my projects.
Oh.
So including like my managers who have been at the lab forever are not US citizens. There are some programs that are only available to US citizens at the labs. It's not something that I do. It's not something that most people at Math do, but if you're really interested in working in national security, that is something that you need a security clearance for. Some of the other labs are going to have more restrictions. So it is something that if you're considering a career at a lab, it is worth talking to someone about. And it can hire, so internships and postdocs, anyone can have. But if you really want to then stay and convert to staff, your options may be limited. That is not the case at PNNL and at some of the other labs, but I know Sandia has more limitations and Argonne has more limitations.
All right. Well, thank you. That's awesome. That's very good information, at least. We have a question in the chat. Jordi's asking if you have used FreeFem Plus for solving PDEs.
So I haven't. I tend not to do finite element simulations just because we started with finite volume codes and kept going. Do you have a specific question about the code or applications, or just in general?
You want to unmute yourself and ask?
Just in general. So I know people who have used it. We tend to, in terms of open source solvers, tend to use OpenFOAM more because the people I work with happen to have expertise in OpenFOAM. So that's what I use it for fluid solvers in general.
All right.
So I have a couple of questions. So one is related to what you use. Do you use LAMPS for the molecular dynamic simulations, or LAMPS?
So, people do. So I don't do molecular dynamic simulations. I have collaborators who do them for me, and they use LAMPS.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And one technical question is, at the beginning, that you are replacing Lennard Jones by this other function, sum of Gaussians. But I noticed that the function that you are I mean, I am assuming that this plot that you have there, yeah, this one is this your new F or this is something else?
This is the new pressure profile that you get from this force F.
Okay. I mean, I wonder if you still are going to get, is this, I mean, is this function still going to infinity for the repulsion? Because I thought maybe your bubbles are collapsing or getting together because these, Leonard Jones will have a strong repulsive. And I wonder if this is losing that.
So the reason we use this instead of so I could do this same simulation with a Leonard Jones. These look very similar. The reason we use this force shape function instead of the Leonard Jones is because for the Leonard Jones, if you solve, so for a static bubble, we should be able to solve for this pressure profile analytically. And for the Leonard Jones, this integral doesn't converge. So we needed we needed to go to infinity, but we needed it to go to infinity at a different rate.
Okay.
So here we can analytically integrate this force. If you're interested in that, it's on archive.
Okay.
It's basically just a lot of integrals that we take. But this analytical value is plotted here and we can't find it. And for the Leonard Jones, we can't take that analytical integral.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay,
yeah,
thanks.
Numerically it still works, but I think because we have the finite resolution, so it kind of cancels that out. But it bothered me that we know it shouldn't work analytically, so then numerically we're kind of hiding an error. Yeah.
All right. Are there more questions? I guess I have a general question, but it's about one of the applications more than research. So I'm really interested in that application about using the nano bubbles to enhance contrast in imaging. But is that so? Where do they put them? Like the bubbles, because putting air in places is also problematic. So
yeah. So this example, let's see. This example is in a lab, so it's not.
Yeah.
The idea would be ultimately they could be injected into a human. So yes, I agree. Injecting nanobubbles could have problems. So there is more research to be done. It's not something I'm an expert in. But I know there's a lot of research going on. This paper from 2015 talks about how they're using it for tumor imaging, and that's where, if you have questions, I would look that up. It's really interesting. Right. They're also using nanobubbles activated with drugs, so they can inject the nanobubbles and have them target a certain area and then burst all the nanobubbles at that area, so you can do really targeted drug delivery, which again is not what I do, so I don't know a lot of the details, but I find it really exciting that there's applications of these.
Very interesting. And so I know you, jumping again to your career, you founded the AWM chapter. Are you still active in that chapter at Brown?
So I do talk to them. Part of when I founded the chapter, part of what we did was put in a way to transition power. I think many student groups, you start and then I didn't want the group to fall apart when I left the school. So what we did is we had an undergraduate and graduate president at the same time. And then we always have the vice president transition to the president, and then we put in term limits. So by the end of my time at Brown, I wasn't leading, like all of the power had been transitioned, and I was still attending events and helping, obviously, but we made sure that there was a model in place for people to take over when I left. So it's still going. I get their event notifications, which is really exciting. I left 3 years ago, so I know they're still doing events, which is great.
That's very cool. And how did you get your postdoc at the National Lab?
Okay, so there's a bunch of different. So speaking from a math department going to a math postdoc, most postdocs or many postdocs are posted on Math Jobs, which is a website it's like if you applied to undergraduate with the Common Application for undergraduate, it's like the Common App, but for postdocs. So most of my peers applied to postdocs through Math Jobs and applied to like 100 postdocs and got interviews. I did not. I think I applied to 2 Math Job postdocs, and instead I emailed everyone I could think of to ask about postdocs. Some postdoc offers I got through attending conferences and giving talks at conferences, and people saw my talks and then had me out to visit after that. And then some at Pnnl, I knew my postdoc advisor from work I've been doing previously, so I talked to him directly. And then for other offers I had, I knew I wanted to do something in computational fluid dynamics. So I looked at the NSF grants that have been out that year, because I figured the people who got grants are the people who have money for postdocs. And I emailed all of those people. And that actually ended up working really well too. So mostly it was word of mouth. I cold emailed a lot of people, and I get a lot of cold emails too, and that is completely appropriate. It helps if you have attach your CV to emails, and it helps if you have some understanding of the work I do. I get a lot of emails from people who clearly have not read my papers or have any understanding of what I do at all. So those probably won't lead to a postdoc offer. But if someone has a good understanding of what I do and have a reason they want to work with me, those emails often do lead to internships or postdocs.
All right.